The point of this video is to sort of trace the development of American independence. I know the idea of the American Revolution is something that you guys talk a lot about in previous social studies classes. So we're really just going to focus on sort of like the government aspects of like the coming of our sort of independence as a country. So just a little historical background information. Before the colonies and the British government controlled them really started to like butt heads, it's interesting to see sort of where the colonies were in terms of like their willingness to sort of unite with each other. In 1754, before things had really started to go bad with the British, Ben Franklin actually proposed a meeting of all the colonies to meet in Albany, New York in 1754. It was called like the Albany Congress. Um, Invitations went out to all 13 colonies and only five showed up. Sort of like highlighting the fact that 1754, like the colonies just didn't see like uniting together as being like an important thing. Franklin was concerned about some attacks by Native American tribes, by French settlers on some of the British colonies, and he just thought it would be better if the colonies sort of cooperated more together, which they hadn't up until about 1754. He drew this famous like join or die cartoon that sort of like warned the colonies that like they were going to be in danger if they didn't start cooperating with one another. Even though only five colonies attended, the representatives from these five colonies came up with a greater plan for like colonial unity. One of the ideas they came up with was like a colonial congress that would meet periodically throughout the year and would discuss matters that impacted all 13 colonies and would also sort of make up policies that would be important for all 13 colonies. Interestingly enough, actually not surprisingly, the British government, when they heard about this, sort of said that they had no intention of allowing their colonies to do this because it didn't really benefit the British government to have the colonies more unified and a little bit more difficult to control. So they opposed it. But the more interesting thing is that the individual 13 colonies also opposed it too. Like at this time, every colony could kind of do whatever it wanted to do. They didn't really want to have to give up some of their independence to the other colonies by joining like a colonial congress. So this is important because it shows that like this is just 22 years before all the colonies are together fighting for independence. That like they didn't even want to be together. So like something pretty dramatic must have happened over those 22 years to push them from not wanting to be together to obviously fighting all together against the British. One of the major turning points of this is something called the French Indian War. The French Indian War is part of like the 7 Years' War that goes on in the rest of the country that you may have, rest of the world that you may have talked about more in European history. This is like the continuing battle between the two sides that can't get along, the French and the British. And the French Indian War is sort of the portion of this conflict that spills over into the American colonies. Um, so real quick, you see on like the left hand side, this is at the beginning of the French Indian War. Sort of all of like the British colonies hugging the coast, and you ended up having sort of like conflicts between French settlers and the British colonies over this disputed land in the middle. Um, One of the things that happens is the British government sends lots of soldiers over to sort of defend its colonies. And as a result of that, like sort of like British military might, you can see that, in 1763, this is a pretty dramatic victory for the British, where they're basically pushing the French threat almost completely off the continent. So you would think this is a major victory for the British government and its colonies, but what it ended up doing was it caused a tremendous amount of debt for the British government to have to fight this war. And then this is what leads to sort of like the taxing of the colonies. And this is like the beginning of the trouble between the colonies who didn't want to be taxed without representation. They didn't have any representation in Parliament, right? And the British government which was looking to recover money that it had to spend defending the colonies in the French Indian War. You begin to see a lot of these goods that are taxed and sort of see like the American colonists' refusal to do this. In 1765, the next sort of colonial meeting is called. It's a Stamp Act Congress, which is called the meeting of the colonies to discuss like all of the taxes the British government to begin to put on them. You see this a picture of like tarring and feathering a stamp tax collector from the British government. And the interesting thing is now that like 9 of 13 colonies attend. So you see, you're already getting more than what attended the Albany Congress about a decade earlier. And then you have other events that transpire. Again, we're really skipping over a lot of this stuff, but you have like the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party. You have lots of other events that transpire. And this famous sort of like engraving or painting was illustrated by Paul Revere of the Boston Massacre, and it's a great sort of like example of like propaganda because it shows like the British soldiers sort of like firing upon these innocent, unarmed like colonists, and there's just some dispute like that's actually how like this went down, but this is what other colonies like saw, and it made the colonists even angrier at the British. And by the time you get to the first and second Continental Congresses that take place in Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia, now into like the 1770s, you're now getting almost all of the colonies like participating. Like they're essentially all there now. And again, it's interesting. In just a short period of time, you went from the colonies wanting nothing to do with each other, but then in response to all the things the British government had done to them, the British government did something for the colonies couldn't do for themselves, which essentially was like push them together and become more unified. And then at the Second Continental Congress, that's when they'll actually authorize Thomas Jefferson to begin working on the Declaration of Independence.